Welcome to The Rational Egoist. I'm your host, Michael Liebowitz. I'm streaming on The Rational Egoist. I'm streaming on The Rational Alternative. Liquid Zulu is streaming on his place. He's got some camera trouble, so we don't get to see his wonderful red hair. But Liam, we can see. We're going to have a great debate. These are two very smart young guys, both under 25, if my math is correct, or my memory, rather. So this is the format. Each guy gets a 10-minute opening. Then each guy gets 3 7-minute talking periods, 10-minute closing. Zulu's going to go first. Liam's going to go last. And each guy also can ask the other guy a question at some point. Like I said, we can't see Zulu. Zulu is a YouTuber. He's a philosopher. Liam is a student. He's also a junior fellow at the Objectivist Institute, right? No, the Objective Institute. It's called
Objective
right?
Standard.
Objective Standard. What? Yeah. Objective Standard Institute. Sorry. Okay. So without further ado, this is a debate about whether objectivism is an open or closed system. We'll turn it over to Liquid Zulu. Your 10 minutes starts now, sir.
Hello. So yeah, thank you for having me on. All that jazz. My opening statement isn't 10 minutes, so I get time to do all that stuff this time. So, philosophy is the science that defines and studies the broadest abstractions possible to serve as man's cognitive guide. What is in contention here today is the proper method for the bracketing off of one philosophy as against another. Specifically, the proper method for the bracketing off of objectivism as against all others. I single this out in particular because the closed objectivists have taken to a peculiar stance on this front for objectivism that is absent from the identification of every other philosophy. Namely, the claim they make is that objectivism has no identifiable essence and is rather the set of beliefs in philosophy that Ayn Rand held. This is not how one identifies any philosophy, and it is not how the closed objectivists identify any other philosophy. If philosophies truly are identified by this nominalist listing off of every position that a philosophy has on every philosophical issue that it tackles, then how could one identify whether someone is a Marxist, or a pragmatist, or a Kantian, unless that person had already listed off their position on every single philosophical issue? This would surely be impossible, and yet it is something that is done by every competent debater ever. What these competent debaters and historians of philosophy are doing is looking at the essential approach to philosophy that their interlocutor is taking. Is someone grounding their positions in dialectical materialism? Then they are a Marxist. Is someone holding that the true is whatever satisfies one's purposes? Then they are a pragmatist, and so on for every other sort of philosophy. What is not being done is waiting for a person to list off every position they hold and seeing if it is a one-to-one match for whomever is the canonical church father for that viewpoint. This is not at all idiosyncratic, not even among objectivist historians of philosophy. Peikoff tells us in his History of Philosophy that Aristotle the man had both Platonist and Aristotelian elements within him. It would simply be impossible to identify Aristotelian elements as separate to Aristotle the man if we were not identifying philosophies by reference to their essence. Indeed, whatever remote deviations Aristotle may have had from the core of this worldliness that he espoused should be bracketed off and ignored. That is how every science is done, and as such, any competent historian of philosophy must do it also. The essence of objectivism is not that Ayn Rand discovered it. The essence is its total and explicit endorsement of the primacy of existence and corresponding application of that principle to every philosophical issue. As Peikoff tells us, quote, "In this respect, there has never been a philosophy to the present which explicitly states the issue of the primacy of existence and carries it out all the way to metaphysics, to epistemology, to ethics, to every issue of philosophy. And that is specifically in metaphysics what objectivism does. In this respect, I would characterize objectivism as the primacy of existence come for the first time to full, consistent, systematic, self-conscious expression," unquote. Peikoff also states that the individual branches of philosophy can have essences. Namely, he tells us that, quote, "the essence of metaphysics is the step-by-step development of the corollaries of the existence axiom," unquote. Pardon me, I'm just going to take a drink of water. My mouth's getting all crazy. The objectivist epistemology has an essence also. Namely, to be objective is to appeal to reality. It is to recognize the primacy that existence has over consciousness, and so on up the rest of the branches. If each individual branch in philosophy can have an identifiable essence, can the branches taken together as a whole not also have an essence? Mightn't we call that essence for a particular arrangement of the essences of the branches a particular philosophy? After all, if we are to take the closed objectivist position to its final conclusion, are we to accept that if Ayn Rand were to, on her deathbed, completely rescind all of her beliefs and accept Jesus Christ into her heart as her Lord and Savior, that the proper objectivist approach to philosophy would be the Christian one? That all those people doing objectivism prior would be retroactively doing it wrong? Would every future historian of philosophy be duty-bound to use objectivist and Christian as synonyms, and come up with some other term for the philosophy we all know and love? This surely strikes any man as ludicrous. Would the proper method for a historian of philosophy not be to bracket this off as the delusions of a dying woman, and keep the term objectivism as identifying those essentials that Ayn Rand espoused? Because, again, the contention in this debate is what the proper method for the demarcation of different philosophies is. We cannot allow for the nominalist creep to force us into identifying some philosophy by what John Doe believed on the 18th of October, 1978 at 11:42 p.m. We must recognize that individual human beings can vary their philosophy over time, and that this variation specifically refers to them holding different fundamental philosophical positions as they progress through life. That at different points, John Doe, or Ayn Rand, or Immanuel Kant might be properly characterized as believing in different essential approaches to the broadest questions possibly answerable. That is, as believing in different philosophies identified by reference to their essence. If the closed objectivists are to be believed, no man could ever change his philosophy, as his philosophy would be an ephemeral blur, constantly adapting itself to every new position on philosophy that he comes to accept. This surely could not be characterized as anything approaching an objectivist approach to studying the history of philosophy. This is a nominalist poison that has clouded the minds of the closed objectivists and cornered them into a worship of Ayn Rand. This approach, if successful, will lead to the death of the objectivist movement and usher in the 10,000-year Kantian Reich. By this one drop, the entire meal becomes poison. All right, that's me done. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Zulu. Okay, Liam, you ready?
Yeah, I'm all good.
Right. Go ahead. When you're down to 1 minute, I'll go like this.
Okay, sounds good. Ready? All right, let's go.
All right, go ahead.
Okay. First thing, thanks, Michael, thanks for hosting this. Zulu, thanks for agreeing to do this. Objectivism is the philosophy of Ayn Rand. And in order to establish why that's the case, there's a couple of fundamental issues we have to unpack. The first thing is the issue of definition. Definitions have a particular purpose. And there's a particular reason why definitions function the way they do. And it's because it's a solution to a problem. When you form concepts and you have an array of concepts, you have a need to organize them. You need to be able to differentiate what concept relates to another concept. And you do this by having two structural components to definitions. You have to first establish in what way a concept is similar to the rest of your concepts, and then you have to establish the way in which concepts are different than the rest of your concepts. And these are reflected in the structural components of the genus and the differentia. It's important to understand that definitions serve exclusively the purpose of conceptual clarity, and that definitions are, in fact, that's how you evaluate what a thing is. Definitions also presuppose a reference. It's something to define. Definitions are not themselves concepts. They're means by which you treat your concepts in order to organize concepts in the rest of your knowledge. With this understood, let's turn to philosophy. Philosophies are defined similarly. So just as if I'm defining man as a rational animal, and I have to identify how this concept relates to the rest of my knowledge, so too do philosophies. Now, I agree with Zulu about the definition of philosophy. It's the discussion of the broadest abstractions with respect to man's relation to existence and his survival struggle. I think that's right. But in defining particular philosophies, you first have to ask the question, what are you defining? Prior to you being able to define a philosophy, you have to first identify what are the units? What is being subsumed by the units. In the case of conceptualizing philosophy, there's a progression. You start out with philosophies as a whole integrated unit. That's the sum of the philosophical principles held by a philosopher. And then from there, you can make abstractions. You can make an identification of this is the essence of a philosopher. But when you do that, what you're identifying is you're identifying what makes a philosophy unique from another philosophy. You're not identifying what the philosophy is, as if the parts of the philosophy which are non-essential are somehow not a part of the concept. This is, in fact, ironically, what Zulu accuses the closed objectivists of doing, of being nominalists. It is the case that definitions identify the uniquely distinguishing characteristic, but what they don't do is they don't omit the non-essential elements from being part of the concept. It's from these grounds that we can then turn to the issue of objectivism. Objectivism is a proper name. It's a proper name that was given to Ayn Rand's philosophy by herself. It's what she titled the integrated sum of her philosophical principles. And she gave it this name precisely for the reason that Zulu alluded to Peikoff giving, which is that her philosophy stands in contrast to the context in which she created her philosophy because of her distinct conception of objectivity, of being reality-oriented and carrying across the primacy of existence. That is not to say that objectivism is any belief Ayn Rand had. It's not. It's not to say that objectivism is only its essence. The essence is just what makes it distinct. And it's not to say that any belief that is objective is objectivism. For a belief, there's a term to evaluate the status, the epistemological status of a philosophy. And that's the term objective. The term objective is an epistemological classification. The term objectivism is a proper name that was given to objectivism by its creator. So why does it matter what terms you use and how you define it? We already established the value of definition. Well, the relevance of the term is important because if you're going to pursue knowledge and conceptualization within a society, you have to acknowledge that there's a division of intellectual labor. And because knowledge is pursued and contributed by multiple thinkers, take, for example, movements, take, for example, philosophical scholarship, or if you're trying to learn the body of context for which you're inheriting, you have a further need to, you have a further standard, a secondary, but constituting standard of how exactly you're going to evaluate what terms to use. And that's based on mutual clarity. So you're able to mutually participate with the rest of the people you're engaging with. And this dimension, this social dimension and public dimension of philosophizing adds considerations. It first obviously adds the consideration of mutually held terms for the purpose of clarity. So consistent usage of a semantic across scholarship so that there's not an equivocation. But it also adds a moral dimension to the evaluation of term usage because you have to be able to give credit where credit is due. You have to be able to be intellectually honest about what you have contributed. You have to have academic integrity. And you also need to have a clarity of allegiance to ideas. You need to be able to clearly designate which people are philosophical allies and which are not. Understanding that then, right, you can see the fallacies that are performed by the open objectivist camp. Now, I'm not going to, there's no need for me to reiterate things which are well established within the literature over this issue. Fact and Value by Peikoff covers this extensively. And there are many debates that are on YouTube right now between Stephen Hicks and Craig Biddle that cover this issue extensively. But I'll focus specifically on the fallacies that I believe Zulu performs, specifically in his approach for open objectivism. It's not the case that objectivists believe that there is no identifiable essence. It's not true. Peikoff explicitly identifies the essence of objectivism as the distinct conception of objectivity. But essences are not what a unit is. Essences are just, in fact, the distinguishing characteristic in contrast to what you're comparing it to. So instead of, it's actually the opposite. Objectivists are nominalists. The accusation is. Zulu says that people correctly identifies what philosophies are by their essences. But observe that in order to identify the essence of a philosophy, you first presuppose the unit, which you are then trying to identify the essence of. The essence does not precede the unit. The unit precedes the essence. And in fact, you can only identify the essential characteristics of a philosophy if you have first conceptualized the philosophy as an integrated unit. He then says that a defense of his approach is that Peikoff alludes to Aristotle having both Aristotelian and Platonic elements. And this is similar to maybe the way he might use the term objective. It's important to understand that the term Aristotelian and Platonic are terms that denote tradition. They do not denote a unit of a philosophy. They denote tradition. And this is because the historical context behind the scholarship on the term Aristotelian and Platonic are talking about tradition. They were given retroactively to the philosophers. Objectivism is not relevantly similar because objectivism was not, a term retroactively given to analyze the essential approach of Ayn Rand. Instead, objectivism is the proper name designated by the person. If in fact Aristotle had said, my philosophy is titled this, then that would be the basis for what his philosophy is. And then you could speak about the term Aristotelian in the sense of tradition. Okay, so if objectivism is not relevantly paired with Aristotelianism, then what would be the term that's similar to refer to the tradition of Ayn Rand? Well, if by the tradition of Ayn Rand you mean what designates her, what is similar to essential method, the answer is you're just asking for the epistemological method of Ayn Rand, which of course is being objective. Being objective is an epistemological status of a philosopher's approach to an idea. Being objective is not the same thing as objectivism, the system designated by the proper name. And it's because of understanding the distinction between the essence of a philosophy and the units which are the philosophies themselves that you can understand in what way you can say there's essences of branches and there's essences of particular issues. It's because you're narrowing your focus for the purpose of clarity and for the purpose of study. But you cannot drop the context. You can't drop the context that you first have an integrated philosophy that you are then evaluating and abstracting in relationship to other philosophies, and then further abstracting a distinguishing method. The last thing is it's important to clarify this. The issue of open-closed objectivism is not the issue of whether or not Ayn Rand's philosophy was true. Whether or not Ayn Rand's philosophy was correct is completely distinct from whether or not we identify what her philosophy is with a given designator. You, in fact, could believe, like Liquid Zulu does, that Ayn Rand gets politics completely wrong. And that you could say, in fact, that she makes inconsistencies with her essential method of approach, in the same way Peikoff says to Aristotle. But that would not change that this philosophy is her philosophy. And it wouldn't mean that the philosophy is not objectivism. Objectivism is a designator. It's not an epistemological evaluation. That's my closing.
Thank you, Liam. Zulu, 7 minutes starts now.
Sure. So this is a debate, as far as I'm concerned, on what the proper method of doing the history of philosophy is. If we were to imagine that we were not a number of decades after Ayn Rand, but rather a number of centuries or a number of millennia after Ayn Rand, we would need to know what is objectivism. If we were doing history of philosophy, what is objectivism? What is objectivism not? That is the question of the debate. Namely, is objectivism an open system? The open system people are claiming that objectivism is one thing. The closed system people are claiming that it's another thing, right? And we don't even have to go out 100 years. We can start now. We can start now by going, okay, what is the proper way of identifying what objectivism is? And it is not a random collection of different beliefs in philosophy. That's not what is essential. Because what is non-essential to objectivism, that's not relevant to the historian of philosophy. What is relevant to the historian of philosophy is what is essential. We don't need to know all the things that makes objectivism the exact same as any other philosophy. We need to know what distinguishes it from other philosophies. And what distinguishes it in particular from every other philosophy is the primacy of existence. That is what is relevant to us as historians of philosophy. We are not living next to Ayn Rand, developing this philosophy, trying to figure out what the essence of this thing is, trying to get at some new approach to philosophy. We are trying to look back through time and figure out what is this thing we're even talking about, and saying it's an enumeration of everything that Ayn Rand held to be true on philosophy. I should clarify. That is not how we do any other part of the history of philosophy. Liam, of course, mentioned that, well, Aristotelian and Platonist, they refer to intellectual traditions. They aren't referring to philosophies. Okay, well, what about pragmatist? Pragmatism is surely a philosophy, a much more recent one, in fact. Is there no essence to pragmatism? Is the essence of pragmatism whatever John Dewey believed? Surely not. There were different sorts of pragmatists. Peikoff, in fact, identifies two different sorts of pragmatists who each share this one essential characteristic. That's how we know they are both pragmatists. We can do the same thing for objectivists. There are different sorts of objectivists, but they each share this fundamental characteristic. The characteristic being the explicit identification and application of the primacy of existence to every major philosophical issue. Let's see here. So I'm just reading through my notes, trying to find what is relevant. So yes, let's... Oh, actually, where was that? Yeah, I don't think calling it the philosophy of Ayn Rand even gets you close to identifying any sort of essence. You would have to just go through and read everything that Ayn Rand wrote on every potential philosophical issue to get what that means. Philosophy of Ayn Rand doesn't begin to identify an essence. So if we're supposed to be, as Liam says, one part of what we're supposed to be doing is at least identifying essences, saying it's the philosophy of Ayn Rand doesn't get us any closer on that front. If I just say, oh, the beliefs in philosophy that Karl Marx held, well, that doesn't get us any closer. If I don't know what Karl Marx believes, it doesn't get us any closer at figuring out what the hell the essence of being a Marxian is. Now, what would get us closer is if I started to elaborate on what dialectical materialism is. I said that is the essence of Marxism. Well, then we're a whole lot closer without even having any prior knowledge of what Karl Marx believes. This is the proper way to do a history of philosophy. So indeed, if there is some identifiable essence of objectivism, as Liam notes, I think I'm correct in that identifiable essence. And I think that is the relevant part, as historians of philosophy, for us to point at. The irrelevant part is not what makes it the same, it's what makes it different. That's what we have to be pointing at. Like, what are we saying when we say objectivist? We're saying objectivist as against these other things. And yeah, I will finish off by saying I completely agree that the issue is not whether objectivism is true or not. And also, I do want to note that I disagree with Stephen Hicks. I saw that debate he had with Craig Biddle. I agree with Hicks's argument against... Biddle's argument against Hicks. I don't believe that objectivism means true philosophy. I think that's frozen abstraction. So I agree on that point. Yeah, I'm done there.
Thanks, Zulu. Okay, Liam, go ahead. 7 minutes.
Thanks. Okay, so the way Zulu frames the conversation is he asks, what is objectivism? Right? And he treats this question as if it is the same question as, what is its essence? And he says that in order to successfully be a historian of philosophy, you need to be able to identify the essences of philosophies. I agree on the front that in order to be a historian of philosophy, you should be able to identify the distinguishing characteristics of philosophies according to others. But when you ask, what is the essence of objectivism? You presuppose that there's a thing that you are identifying the essence of. The philosophy itself is the thing you are defining, right? In the same way, if I defined man, you have the concept, right? And you have this mental unit, and you are then contrasting this mental unit to the rest of your items of knowledge. The unit precedes the definition, and it precedes the essence, because the essence is your means of taking this and relating it to the rest of your ideas. So when you ask, what is the essence of objectivism? You're presupposing the essence of the unit, right? So you first have the unit, and then you have the essence. The essence is not the unit. The essence is what makes the unit distinct from the rest of your ideas. So when you ask, what is the essence? You also ask, in contrast to what? What is the difference of objectivism? You already know, you have the concrete, and then you're contrasting it to other things in respect to what it is. So I'll take Zulu's example for a moment. He says, does the closed objectivist believe that there is no essence to philosophies? No. Of course, there are essences to philosophies. There are things that make philosophies unique and distinct from other philosophies. But the whole point is that philosophies are not what makes them distinct. They are things that have distinguishing characteristics, right? So it's not as if the philosophy is the distinguishing characteristic, and that's the fallacy. And this is why it's a kind of nominalism, because it's not as if the essence, the definition, just is the term, or just is the concept. So is there no essence to pragmatism? There is. There is an essence to pragmatism, because pragmatism is not the philosophy of John Dewey. It's a tradition. Pragmatism has been identified as a tradition. They identify as a tradition. And this is why these parallels don't work, because objectivism is not a tradition. Objectivism is a proper name for a philosophy. Now, the reason it's confusing is because in the history of philosophical scholarship, there is no, it's not common for philosophers to say, my philosophy is this. I will call my philosophy this and give it a name. But in fact, when you conceptualize philosophies, what do you have? You have the philosophy of John Dewey, right? And you have the other philosophies. And what you identify is you take the philosophies of these people, right? You take their philosophical works, you understand them as an integrated unit, and then you try to identify what the essential characteristics of their philosophies are. And now you conceptualize tradition and you conceptualize approach. And then you can then talk about the approaches and how they relate to each other. And then you can take the approaches and then evaluate the concretes you abstracted from. But the whole point is that it's self-defeating to say that the system you're trying to identify is the essence. The system is what the essence is supposed to capture, so it comes first. So there is an essence to pragmatism, and objectivists believe that there are essences to philosophies. Zulu says, essentially, the confusion is that you're equivocating the level of abstraction, right? If you wanted to, it only makes sense historically to talk about philosophers as having certain philosophies and then abstracting away their essential approaches. So it is, like I said, like objectivism does have an essence. It has something which makes it distinct when compared to other particular philosophies. But the act of defining an essence presupposes that there are concrete particular philosophies that are an integrated unit. And so you can't simultaneously say that. Now, I do want to clarify what goes unresponded to, and what I'll further develop is that there is a moral dimension to the usage of terms. And it's because, one, of clarity, but it's also to a matter of justice and honesty. If something within the historical scholarship, if you're interested in engaging with the historical scholarship, which you are, because you're a member of a philosophical movement and you commit advocacies and you make content, then you have to consider the facts of what the terms mean historically. And are you being revisionary about the historical precedent of a term? Now, it's okay to be revisionary about the historical precedent of a term, but you have to give reasons why relating to the standards of clarity and the conventions surrounding it, right? Like Ayn Rand does this with egoism. The virtue of selfishness is a new conception of egoism. Like the term egoism didn't mean that, but what she's doing is she's giving an argument for why you should use that term to designate this idea. So in the same way, there's not an argument for why the term objectivism should, despite the fact being having developed scholarship, despite being the title given to an achievement made by a philosopher, should now be revised to just mean to substitute something which already has a term, which is being objective. So objectivism is not the same thing as the epistemological status of something being objective. So yeah, I mean, I'll start on there.
Thanks, Liam. Okay, Zulu, you're up.
Just to be clear, is this my final rebuttal, and then we go into, I can't remember the...
No, this is your second. You're getting 3.
Okay. So Liam is saying that I am framing this as what is objectivism and treating that as the same question, what is the essence of objectivism? And that to be a successful historian of philosophy, you have to identify essences, and he agrees with this. But then when you ask what the essence is, you presuppose that there is a thing that you are identifying the essence of. The philosophy is the thing that you are defining. Indeed, there already was this philosophy developed by Ayn Rand, and Nathaniel Branden, and other figures. And you can come along and figure out that essence. It was already there, and you can figure out what that essence was. Indeed, I'm not saying that you are doing this rationalistically, that you just have this essence in your mind, and then it comes out of that. Anything like that. There were these people who were discovering, namely Ayn Rand, she was discovering this particular approach to philosophy. And you can then, in retrospect, figure out what that approach was, what is essential to that approach. And that is how, in retrospect, you are supposed to talk about it. That's how you talk about every philosophy in retrospect. You look at what is it essentially saying? What is this philosopher essentially saying? That's how you do it. Then there's the point on tradition versus Ayn Rand's approach to saying, this is my philosophy. So Liam is saying that, well, pragmatism has already been identified. Pardon me. Pragmatism has already been identified as a tradition, whereas objectivism is not a tradition. So that's why pragmatism isn't just the philosophy of John Dewey, whereas objectivism is the philosophy of Ayn Rand. So my quandary would be, well, at what point does it become a tradition? When does it swap from being a tradition to something else? Whatever we want to call this other sort of way of identifying philosophies. If I were to become, let's say, vastly more popular, let's say we develop, immortality drugs tomorrow, and I live for thousands of years, and over that lifespan, I become vastly more popular than Ayn Rand, and I become like Mr. Objectivist. Everybody looks towards me for what objectivism means. And I'm saying what I'm saying. At that point, would it become a tradition? Or still, if 99% of the trillions of people who live across the galaxy all think of objectivism in the same way as I think about it, would it still be the honest thing to do to stick by this zombie philosophy, this worship of a dead woman? Would that still be the correct way for historians of philosophy to identify this at odds with trillions of people, how they understand it? And if that's not the correct way, if objectivism could become a tradition under these conditions, well then, is it possible for me to then become like retroactively correct if a century out from now I win out, as I predict, I win out and the objectivist movement is almost all open objectivists? And at that point, would it matter if Ayn Rand said, well, this is my philosophy, and that's what distinguishes her to the other traditions you're calling them? Would it matter, she said, that? Well, it wouldn't, because it's just a tradition. It is a tradition. So it doesn't matter if Ayn Rand is deviating it from it in this one way or in any other way, because it's a tradition. It doesn't matter if her deviation is saying that it's not a tradition. Let's say she even explicitly said exactly what Liam was saying, that this is not a tradition, this is my philosophy, this is what makes me different to everybody else, so on and so forth. She isn't explicitly saying that. But let's say she did. Would it matter, or could that just be a deviation from the tradition? And then Liam was saying that I didn't respond to the fact that there is a moral dimension to the usage of the terms, the one of clarity, but also justice and honesty. And that if you're interested in engaging in historical scholarship, then you have to consider what is being meant historically, and only be revisionary if you are giving reasons for why you're being revisionary. So I think I've given ample reasons with respect to these virtues. I think I've given those reasons in my work thus far, perhaps not in this debate. So I think it is dishonest to treat objectivism as this special case. I don't think you can just get to decree from on high, this is some special case. Historians of philosophy, for all future time, you're no longer allowed to treat objectivism as in the same genus as every other philosophy. You've got to treat this as this one special case. I don't think that's very honest. I don't think that is giving objectivism its due. This is exactly the sort of thing which leads, if you go onto any philosophy forum or ask any like professional philosopher, most of them at least, is objectivism a philosophy? Most of them say no, objectivism isn't a philosophy. It's this special case. Sure, Ayn Rand, she came up with this amazing theory of epistemology. Whatever you think of the theory of epistemology, is clearly she's doing epistemology there. Well, this is the sort of behavior which leads people down that road. That's not giving objectivism its due. It's not treating it as a philosophy as every other philosophy. It's treating it as this special case where we get our own little section, fenced off from the rest. That's not how you're supposed to do any sort of history of philosophy. So yeah, I think I'll be done there.
Am I good, Michael?
You
Am I
know?
good? Oh, I think I'm good, right? Okay, awesome. All right, I'll go. Okay, so Zulu asked the question, what is the essence of the approach? Like this is the thing that philosophical historians use. And then he agrees, right? He agreed that philosophies, they're first the units the particular concrete philosophies, and then you abstract the essence from them. So he's agreeing with the epistemic point about definitions. But the point is now this. The point is that once you've asked the question, what is the essence of the approach, right? That's how you should talk about the philosophy in retrospect. That presupposes the goal and context for the act of definition and the purposes of scholarship. Because in fact, part of scholarship is an investigation over what was the philosophy of a person, like developing and understanding their account, which is then, a precondition for the next element, which is what makes their account different, and which is how you think about the essential characteristic of their philosophy. So it is true that thinking in terms of essentials is required for philosophical scholarship. But it's not the case that you then drop the context over designating rigidly what a philosophy is and what it's not. It's wrong to say Aristotle's philosophy are certain things that he did not say. Even if you want to say that these things are Aristotelian in tradition, you have to account for the whole context of this is an abstraction of method and an application of a method that Aristotle originated to this issue. So it's a matter of conceptual life or death, of clarity, life or death clarity, as to whether or not you define clearly what philosophies are and then what their approaches and essences are. And so it's the very same thing with objectivism. If you're going to ask, well, how does objectivism sit in the history of philosophy? If you're trying to answer these questions, you have to first know what objectivism is. And it's the same thing with Aristotelian scholarship and Hegelian scholarship. The only reason this is something that's confusing is because the proper name given to Ayn Rand's philosophy is done differently in the way that proper names have been given to other philosophies. For example, if we just retroactively say Aristotle's philosophy is Aristotle's philosophy, right? Aristotle didn't say this is my creation. Ayn Rand's doing it differently. She said this is my creation, and there's nothing wrong with that. That's the title she gave. It's like saying Atlas Shrugged isn't like each and every single page. Atlas Shrugged is like the general theme of the book. Atlas Shrugged isn't the theme of the book. The book has a theme, but the book is the book, and the book should be referred to as what it was titled by the person who invented the book as a matter of justice. And so this issue, because Zulu responds to this at the end, that he thinks that the term, he's given ample reason for why the term means something different. And he motivates this by talking about at what point does something become a tradition. Well, things don't become traditions. Like that, it's important to understand. Like that's not the way you should think about a term. Oh, it transitions from a philosophy to a tradition, or transitions to a proper name of a philosopher's philosophy and then to a tradition. The point is that we just have terms that designate philosophies, and we have terms that designate traditions. And you can understand whether the term does that based on the historical context surrounding the usage of the term. And importantly, how the ideas come about, and then how the conceptualization, the nomenclature of it comes about. Like I said, I already explained this with Aristotle. It's the same thing with pragmatism. As Zulu gives this example, he goes, well, what if I become really popular and I talk about objectivism and I use the term objectivism as a tradition? Well, why is that inappropriate? Well, it's inappropriate for the same reason why, imagine you developed a novel or something like that. And you developed a novel based on the theme of Atlas Shrugged, the philosophical essence of Atlas Shrugged. And then you called the novel and all the books in the series Atlas Shrugged. It's not Atlas Shrugged. It's like Atlas Shrugged. It's essentially similar to Atlas Shrugged, but it's not Atlas Shrugged, right? And so the reason why, and this goes back to the point, is that you have the units and then you have the definition. If you are revisionary and you then change the term, or you treat the term objectivism as if it denotes tradition, what do you lose? You lose the integrity of the unit you're trying to define and categorize in the history of philosophy. And so when Zulu makes the comments that, well, movements, they need this kind of tradition in order to have integrity, and you need them in order to progress, it's the opposite. If you don't have an understanding clearly of what the units are that give rise to the abstraction of the method, and you don't clearly distinguish the philosophy as a unit versus the philosophy as the term to designate its approach, then you end up equivocating the two. And why is that unjust? It's unjust because you're wrongfully attributing things to a philosopher. You're misrepresenting the philosopher because the term designates their philosophy. And again, I think this particular point has not been addressed. That objectivism is not an epistemological classification of the essence of an idea. It's not. What it is, it's a proper name. When Zulu says, well, is it a kind of special pleading epistemologically? Is it a kind of unique, is it a dropping of principle, or is there some kind of inconsistency in approach when treating objectivism compared to other philosophies? No. It's the same approach. But the difference is that objectivism, its scholarship, and the generation of the nomenclature historically has been different. And so the treatment of the way you refer to it is necessarily different. If you decided tomorrow that you wanted to create a systematic philosophy, right, and that you wanted to, define its principles, and that was your philosophy, and you named it, right? You named it, Zulianism or whatever. And then, Eduardo, our good friend, takes your ideas. He's like, this is the essence of Zulu's thought. And then he goes off and he says, this is really Zulianism. This is the essence of what Zulu said. Well, why is that improper? Because it drops the context and misrepresents what your views are. It creates confusion necessarily, because there is developed scholarship over the term. And in fact, if people were philosophical historians and you became very popular, it would be problematic for you to use the term objectivism, because your philosophy is understood by its contrast to this particular philosopher, abstracting her method and then apply it to your philosophy. But if you equivocate the method and the philosophy, it gets unclear what exactly the level of abstractions are in the causal history. I'll stop that there.
Thanks, Liam. All right, Zulu, this is your last 7-minute go around.
Cool. So, yes, I'll start from the top. You're saying that I agree that philosophies refer to units, and that you abstract the essence from them. Yeah, indeed. And then you're saying the point is that when you've asked what is the essence of the approach, that presupposed the goal and the context for scholarship. That part of the scholarship is investigation into what the philosophy was of a person, which then yields the second part, namely what is essential to that. And then I'm dropping the context of that first part. And that it would be, to sum up, that it would be wrong to say that Aristotle's philosophy is things that he didn't say. So this is not, again, how we do things anywhere else. In fact, these are actually two examples that I got from Onkar Ghate and somebody else who were trying to defend the closed theory, the closed objectivist system theory. So there's the theory of evolution versus Darwin's ideas in biology, where they were equivocating between, or making some sort of an equivalence between Darwin's ideas in biology and objectivism, whereas the theory of evolution would be equivalent to something. I don't know. It seems very clear to me that Darwin's ideas in biology would be equivalent to Ayn Rand's ideas in philosophy, and the theory of evolution would be equivalent to objectivism, right? I don't think it would be wrong to say that there are things in the theory of evolution that are not present in Darwin's ideas in biology. I don't think that would be wrong. Indeed, many developments have been made within the umbrella of the theory of evolution, which Darwin didn't identify, but they are doing the exact same essential thing that he was doing. The other example they gave was Einstein and his theory of general relativity. Now, Einstein, you're saying, well, Ayn Rand, she's saying that this is my philosophy. Einstein said, this is my theory on gravity, and it's called the general theory of relativity. This is my theory, right? But that doesn't mean that you can never make any developments on the general theory of relativity and have it still be part of the general theory of relativity. Indeed, there were, my apologies, it's been a while since I've done my physics education, but I'm almost certain, and I can look this up after the stream if you want, that there were other developments made in the general theory of relativity outside of what Einstein was saying, right? This is how we do things everywhere else. That's how you do it. And then you were saying that things, in response to my point about traditions, well, what if I became super popular, yada, 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 would it become a tradition? You're saying that things don't become traditions. Okay, so then if every single person, let's say tomorrow, everybody on Earth watches this debate, and everybody except for Liam ends up agreeing with me, and they all become open objectivists. And then, presumably, because things can't become traditions, it wouldn't be a tradition. So therefore, we are no longer dealing with what would consist of a consistent use of a semantic across scholarship, because the consistent use of that semantic would then, from that point on, be the exact one that I'm stating, right? But in your opening statement, you were talking about the social dimension, how the social dimension of philosophizing adds the need of a consistent use of a semantic across scholarship. And that was the whole thrust of why I was being inconsistent in my use of a semantic. I'm breaking from not the tradition, I suppose. I'm breaking from something. But this is clearly at odds now, because you're saying that things can't become traditions. But if the consistent use of the semantic is my one, I suppose you could call it the traditionalist approach to it. Well, then we're no longer, then it's not consistent to be using the old head, the zombie approach to it. And lastly, you were saying that if you don't have an understanding of what the units are, then you end up equivocating, namely wrongfully attributing things to a philosopher. Now you're being very abstract there, which I find a problem with, because specifically your accusation would be that I'm attributing things to Ayn Rand, because you're holding this is a special case. Now this is different to any other philosopher, right? So I would be attributing things to Ayn Rand, whereas if I were to talk about the modern pragmatist movement, where pragmatism has ended up, which I do frequently, you're not saying that I'm attributing things to John Dewey, right? It's, oh, John Dewey didn't believe that Michael Rectenwald should be the presidential candidate for the Libertarian Party. You're attributing things to him, which he never said. Of course, because I'm talking about the pragmatist philosophy, how it has progressed through time. So nobody would think that in that case. Nobody thinks when they watch my videos that I'm talking, even the closed objectivists, nobody thinks that I'm saying that Ayn Rand is saying these things. Nobody thinks this. But the closed objectivists like us to pretend, like us to all put on our pretend hats and pretend that whenever anybody hears me say anything, that Ayn Rand is in effect speaking through my lips, that I'm just parroting off what Ayn Rand said. Nobody believes this. When I had a debate with Haz Al-Din not too long ago, I don't believe that what he was saying was just Karl Marx possessing his body from beyond the grave, and he's attributing things to Karl Marx which Karl Marx never claimed. Nobody believes that. This is not what anybody believes. So I don't understand where this wrongful attribution of things to some philosopher comes from. Not some philosopher, specifically Ayn Rand. And I also, you're saying, well, you need to understand what the units are. Well, I don't understand what the unit is when you just say it's the set of beliefs held by Ayn Rand. I don't understand what the unit is. What would help me understand what the unit is saying, okay, well, this is what they're essentially saying. Pointing at the essence, saying, okay, well, this is what's going on. That's how I recall what is the unit of Aristotle's philosophy. Well, I think back to the History of Philosophy by Leonard Peikoff. And I go, okay, well, what did Aristotle essentially say? Oh, yeah, he was saying this essentially. He was essentially this worldly as against Plato's otherworldliness. And he was responding to these specific points, and that's how he built up his philosophy. That's what I think of when I think of Aristotle. I'll close up there.
Thanks, Zulu. All right, Liam, this is your last 7 minutes, and then you each get to ask each other a question and then closings.
Sure. Okay. Yeah, so let's start out with this. To clarify the issue of things becoming traditions. The point is that when I say things cannot simply become traditions, it's to say that in thinking of something as a tradition, as opposed to a particular philosopher's ideas, it's just the difference is the level of abstractness and the purpose of the abstraction and what the abstraction is a contrast with. Certainly, it would be the case that if you were inspired by Rand and you behaved Rand-like, or people were inspired by you and they behaved Zulu-like, you could say that there's a tradition here. And in that sense, like, of course, if people are following along, quote unquote, right, you can say there's tradition. But the point in contemplation, considering something as a tradition, or considering a philosophical whatever as a tradition, is the act of taking a concrete unit and then treating it as, okay, what is the essence of it? And then treating the essence as a unit and then using it as a measure for, okay, how do philosophies pair up to this unit, the abstract unit of the method, not the abstract unit of the particular philosophy. Now, it gives an example of Einstein's views as a theory, or Einstein's views as a scientist versus Einstein's theories. Well, this is actually completely consistent with what's being said, and it's why Onkar brings this example up. If you're trying to understand Einstein's views, right, in terms of Einstein's scientific understanding. If you're evaluating the ideas as a part of his wider understanding of physics, right? Well, then of course, then there are elements of general relativity, right, that are not part of Einstein's theory, right? So if you take the particular, principles about E equals mc squared, all the consequences of relative motion, whatever. If you're evaluating those as a part of Einstein's integrated scientific picture, well, then of course you would never refer to other things as general relativity. But in fact, general relativity denotes, right, a tradition, because you're thinking about the idea as a kind in contrast to other ideas. So do you understand? There's a distinction epistemologically between defining something with respect to the broader origin or the broader context in which it's conceived, right, which is the philosophy or whatever the thinker's system of ideas are, and then there's the issue of evaluating it with respect to the division of labor intellectually. And these are epistemological evaluations. They're not evaluations of who's responsible for whatever. Now, of course, if you tried to say, I think that point's been made clearly. Now, Zulu says, I'm not attributing anything to Ayn Rand. Well, whether you use the term objectivism to mean the philosophy of Ayn Rand, that doesn't change the act being performed and the signal it sends and the impact you have on the thing you're actually, in fact, participating in. It's like denying that you're choosing to live because you're not thinking in terms of I'm choosing to live. In fact, there is a context for the usage of a term. There is a scholarship. There is a movement that you are a part of.
I think my headphones just died there. And because there's a broader movement that you're a part of, you have to understand and consider those implications when you speak. In fact, it's like the Atlas Shrugged example I gave. I don't think that quite would respond to. And so I don't think there's an answer to the point. The point is that there is a distinct historical story. There's a causal story behind the nomenclature about objectivism, and it's the title of a philosophy. It's explicitly a title of philosophy. It's like this. It's like if somebody tried to say that I'm going to call somebody Liam, and when I call somebody Liam, I'm really talking about the style of their soul. I'm talking about the essence of their character. I'm not designating Liam the concrete. I'm using the term Liam, which has been designated as the proper name for a concrete. I'm going to use that as the term to designate people that are within, as the sense of life that Liam has, the tradition that he has. Well, of course, that's scholastically disruptive. You say, well, wouldn't it be bad scholastically if everybody became, I believe what I believe? Wouldn't it be bad then if we called it objectivism? Well, no, because that drops the historical context. Reality sets the context. The reality is that there is a history of a scholarship using the term. And in fact, the primary literature, which these ideas are from and originate from and can be conversed and informative to the people who have received the benefits of the division of labor, the context would be completely contradictory because there'd be an equivocation between the scholarship, the ideas, and what these people believe. So this is exactly the point I made. I don't think this has been responded that revising a very well-established historical term within the historical precedent in this context is not something beneficial. And this goes back to you saying, well, I don't think that there's, what is objectivism's essence? What's its genus? And you said, well, objectivism, you have to think about it in terms of its essence. Essences are useful. That's why they exist. And you can explain Aristotle's philosophy using an essence. But it's important to understand that the essence is exactly that. It's a distinguishing characteristic. It's not the idea. The last point here is there's a comment about objectivism. Well, it's just an arbitrary set of beliefs. It's not a set of beliefs. The genus is clear. The genus of objectivism is very clear. Whenever you contrast it as a philosophy compared to other philosophies, it's the originator, right? It's the integrated sum. And you can then talk about, well, what's its essential characteristic as a philosophy versus the other ones in terms of the epistemological evaluation of that. And you can say it's objective or you can talk about method. I'll end that there. I'll save the rest for closing.
Thanks, Liam. We didn't discuss who got to ask first. Is it okay if Zulu asked the question first, Liam? Do you care?
Sure, that's fine.
All right. 5 minutes each for response. Is that enough time?
Yeah, that's fine.
All right, Zulu, go ahead. You ask your question of Liam, and then Liam can ask a question of Zulu, and then closings.
Sure. So I think that I've got two possible questions here. I'll go with the first one. So I want to know, what are philosophers that change their viewpoint on some philosophical issue? Pardon me. So let's say if Ayn Rand had, like, on her deathbed, rescinded every position she held and embraced Jesus Christ as her Lord and Savior, would the proper objectivist position be Christianity? Or would this rightly be bracketed away as the delusions of a dying woman and not essential to the objectivist approach to philosophy? Namely, should we just say, oh, well, objectivism, she said it meant accepting Jesus Christ. Well, therefore, objectivists just are Christians now. Now we got to change all the books.
Yeah, so I think the answer to this question, it goes back to understanding the context and purpose of identifying a proper name and a definition. So a similar case historically, right, is you have Wittgenstein. So what Wittgenstein did is he created a treatise on philosophy. He solved it. He finished it. He beat philosophy. He wrote his book, whatever. And then afterwards, he just completely changed his mind. And he's like, no, I didn't really finish what I started. And he had a completely new approach, and the philosophy was different. And we make the distinction historically between early life and late life Wittgensteinian thought. Now, this is easy because we're thinking retroactively about, okay, we're giving the proper name. There wasn't an active labeling performed by Wittgenstein. Similar with Nietzsche, right? Like at the end of his life, I think his sister, he was like loopy or whatever, but at the end of his life, his sister was like writing stuff, and like that work is not Nietzsche's. It's not really Nietzsche's work. And so I'll give one more concrete to explain. Suppose for a moment you see somebody who goes through a massive reform in their character, right? There's an expression of this person's a different kind of person. They're a different person now. And there's a sense in which that's certainly true. The style of somebody's approach to life, the fundamental principles by which someone guides themselves, their values, those can be different across the course of their lives. And so you could rightfully designate, a substantial change between the two. Now, when Ayn Rand identifies her philosophy, right, she's doing that within the context of the philosophical ideas and principles, right? And in fact, it's okay to do that because she has an integrated view. Now, it is the case that, she didn't change her philosophy, late life, whatever. But suppose for a moment that Ayn Rand did become Christian at the end of her life. That wouldn't change the term objectivism. It wouldn't change the term objectivism because the term objectivism is not dynamic. This is actually precisely oh wow, I'm sorry, there's a lot of dogs barking in the background. The term objectivism is it's not dynamic. It's a proper name. And the attribution of the proper name was given to a particular philosophy. And if you could see that a person has substantial changes in their philosophical convictions across their life, and they say, well, this is my philosophy. It's like if I said when I was 13, this is who I am, right? And now I say this is who I am, and they're different. You just have to account for the context. It gets tricky because just semantically, right? I'm using the same terms, but in fact, when you account for the context, I don't think there's a problem. So no, I don't think that objectivism, if Ayn Rand had visionary thoughts at the end of her life, I don't think what she designated as objectivism, what scholarship talks about, would change what it is.
Okay, Liam, thank you. Now you get to ask Zulu a question.
Okay. So if objectivism, according to you, is denoting a method of approach, it denotes a style of approaching philosophy, namely, primacy of existence applied consistently. There's already a concept for this, which is being objective. The term objective is an epistemological concept. That, in fact, that's what it's defined as. It's orientation, it's reality focus, right? Why then would you then try to introduce or, reform a term to then mean the same thing as a term which already exists within your arsenal to then categorize philosophies and evaluate them?
Okay, so I'll say right off the bat, if I were to go to one of my Kantian friends, I know, shock and horror, but I do have them. I've got plenty of friends who are Kantians. Don't worry, I'm not being racist. So if I were to say, well, you should be objective here, well, what would they take that to mean? They would take it to mean being collectively subjective, as Peikoff puts it. That's what they would claim being objective means. If I just say that, well, this guy, if I'm trying to explain philosophy to my little sister, I say, well, this philosopher, he's being objective. That wouldn't get her any closer to understanding what the heck I'm talking about. Because everybody is talking about being objective in different ways. Every philosopher, for the most part, they love claiming that they are the ones who are being objective. Now, how do we cut through this? Well, Ayn Rand, she has a specific understanding of what that means. She has her trichotomy, where most have their dichotomy. Being objective, that's out there. Objective is out there, whereas subjective is in here, right? She has her trichotomy, intrinsic versus objective versus subjective. Now, to be clear, she is being idiosyncratic here. So if we're caring about having consistent semantics across scholarship, we have to acknowledge that she is being idiosyncratic. Now, she's correct in her idiosyncrasy, but she is being idiosyncratic. Now, so how would I identify the specific idiosyncrasy that I'm pointing to? I can't just say, well, I'm being objective. I can't just say that. What is your philosophy? Well, I like to be objective. Imagine if you tried to pull that off in any debate. Come on, Liam. Let's debates. If somebody came to you and they said, well, what are you doing in philosophy? Well, I'm being objective. That's not gonna. There's gonna need to be a whole lot more than that. That's not sufficient. But if you said I'm an objectivist, well, that's okay. Now I understand what you're getting at. So that's what you have to do. You have to say, well, I'm not just being objective. I'm an objectivist. I have this particular understanding of what it means to be objective, and that is called objectivism. Okay, so so we would have to call the person who is approaching. What is the name for the person who is approaching philosophy in this way? We don't call the person. What is their philosophy? Being objective. Well, that's not a philosophy, right? What do we call the person? It's a different realm of words. I don't know the correct. I'm not a linguist, unfortunately. But it's the distinction between the activity they're doing, objectivists be objective, and how you refer to the person in particular. Oh, that is an objectivist. An objectivist is one who is objective. A swimmer is one who swims. Oh, what's his profession? Oh, he's a swimmer, right? He's a swimmer. He's one who swims. What is his profession? Swimming, right? That's the distinction. So yeah, I think I think I'm good there.
Okay, now Zulu, you get to talk yet again for your 10-minute closing. You can start now.
Sure. So let me see here. Yeah, I think overall, what needs to be kept in mind is what is the point of the debate. I think it's very clear. What is the point of the debate? How do you talk about objectivism? I think even Liam would agree with this. If we're to be proper historians of philosophy, how do you talk about objectivism? What is objectivism? What are we pointing at? Now, for any other set of beliefs, any other, he doesn't like that term actually, any other philosophy, we would be pointing at the essence if we're historians of philosophy. Oh, what does pragmatism mean? Oh, it's the philosophy which says such and such. It's the philosophy which holds that the true is that which satisfies your purposes. That's what's essential to it. Now you get what we're going after, right? That's how you do it for every other philosophy. Now, objectivism is supposed to be the special case in the mind of the closed objectivist. It's supposed to be a special case. But it just isn't, right? It's supposed to be a special case because Ayn Rand said so. Ayn Rand said, "This is my philosophy," and if we don't go away from that, if we go away from that in any way, well, then we're perhaps unintentionally attributing things to Ayn Rand when we're not supposed to. I mean, prove it, quite frankly. Find anybody who watches, for instance, any of my videos. My video on the one where I respond to Ayn Rand, anarcho-capitalism responding to critics, right? Find somebody who's watching that video and going, yeah, this guy, he's parroting off what Ayn Rand says. He's attributing these things to Ayn Rand. Anybody apart from the closed objectivists who think that. Nobody actually believes that. Like, I think this is it's ludicrous. So yeah, he was telling us that there's this distinct historical causal story around the nomenclature about objectivism. And I can just come in and style it any way I want. There's this history about the primary literature, and the context of that is contradictory to everything I believe. Well, that is still dependent, and he's claiming I'm not responding to this point. Well, that point I think I have, because that point is still depending upon the claim that I'm at least perhaps unintentionally attributing things to Ayn Rand. But nobody believes this. It's not that I am, that I'm effacing this historical literature, and I'm just spitting at it, because I'm not attributing things to what that is saying. I'm saying what I'm saying, only what I'm saying. Another point, Liam was saying that objectivism is not a set of beliefs; it's rather the integrator. I mean, well, no. Objectivism is not Ayn Rand. Surely, at least on the closed objectivist viewpoint, objectivism would be the philosophy of Ayn Rand. That is the set of beliefs on philosophy that Ayn Rand held. How else am I supposed to interpret that? It isn't the integrator. The integrator is Ayn Rand. Objectivism isn't Ayn Rand, as it turns out. Yeah, I think this is characteristic of the debate as a whole. I am just kind of following what every previous historian of philosophy does for every philosophy other than the closed objectivists for objectivism. And it is completely improper to make this special case. As Liam indeed himself told us, that if Ayn Rand were to have this crazy change towards Christianity at the end of her life, well, then we would have to make a distinction between early Rand and late Rand. Though we'd have to keep objectivism meaning exactly what it means right now, funnily enough. But then at the very least, we can bracket off these separate periods with respect. And how do we do that? We look at the essences. That's how we do it. And so, it still brings up the question, the ever lingering question of, well, then what if Ayn Rand just said both were her philosophy right from the get-go? Would we have to accept contradiction within our history of philosophy? If some philosopher comes around tomorrow and says their philosophy both is A and not A, will every historian of philosophy have to use contradictions from that point on? Like, it's nonsense. This is not how history of philosophy is supposed to be done. You don't just accept what the philosopher says on face value. She's doing this meta-level thing, sort of like a poisoning of the history of philosophy from that point on. Now, she just poisons it by saying, no, historians of philosophy, you've got to identify this as my philosophy. No, actually, I don't have to accept that. Actually, I can identify it perfectly well myself. Thank you. You don't just accept what the philosopher says and go, yep, that's true. She's making a point here. You don't just say, yep, that's true, therefore. And now every historian of philosophy, if they're to be honest, they've got to accept that as true. They cannot break from that at all. No, that's not how it's done. He was also saying that, well, if Ayn Rand did change her view, then it wouldn't change. Yeah, it wouldn't change the meaning of objectivism because it's a proper name. It was attributed to a particular philosophy. So then, what would we say? That she is indeed breaking from the tradition, perhaps. It seems to me that she's breaking from some sort of tradition here, and that's how we're able to figure out that she's no longer an objectivist. I'm just trying to be consistent in that application there. Yeah, I'm done there.
I think your mic's muted, Michael.
Thank you, Zulu, and thank you, Liam, for pointing out my mic was muted because of my dogs were barking. Okay, Liam, go ahead. It's your turn for 10 minutes.
All right, I appreciate you. Yeah, so let's recap with this. The burden and issue of the conversation is about evaluating the usage of the term objectivism and is about what objectivism is, what its essence is. What we've established at the course of the conversation is the theoretical groundwork to evaluate definitions, term usage. The evaluation of definitions and term usage. we've seen that the concretes precede the essences. That you first have the concretes, and then you can give them proper names, and then you can abstract away the distinguishing characteristic of certain concretes from others. You can then treat that abstraction as its own unit, and then you can treat the things that are subsumed within that unit as a tradition. That's the way that the conceptualizing works for philosophical scholarship. There's two components. There's identifying what philosophers have said, and then there's identifying the evaluation of those philosophers, how they're similar, how they resemble each other, how certain ideas resemble other ideas, how certain approaches can make use of certain ideas, things like that. That's the method. We both agree with the basic method. So the framing from the outset that objectivists frame themselves in a position, they weirdly participate in the history of philosophy, or they participate in a way that historians don't do. That's not true. They're operating in the exact same way. They're identifying what the philosophers say, what their views are, and then defining the essence. So objectivism cannot be the essence. That's not what the concept is. The concept is not the essence. Men are not just the rationality and their animality. They're particular concrete creatures that you refer to as a man because of their distinguishing characteristics when contrasted to other things. And given that, it's wrong to characterize objectivism as an open system, and it's wrong to characterize it as an approach. It flies in the face of the very standards that we agreed philosophical scholarship operates with. If you have the concrete, which is the item of study and the foundation for the abstraction of a certain method, if you then introduce into the scholarship a debate between the proper name of the idea you're studying and the essential approach of the idea you're studying, you're going to commit acts of equivocation. The objectivist epistemology, which is the conception of objectivity, is the essential feature of objectivism that makes it distinct from the other philosophies in kind, as a kind of philosophy. But it's not what objectivism is. If somebody believes that we should have anarchy, if somebody believes that tolerance is a cognitive virtue, these people do not endorse the philosophy of Ayn Rand. Now, you might want to make an argument that they're right. You might want to say that they are, in fact, being objective. But it'd be wrong to designate their ideas as part of objectivism, because objectivism is a proper name. We talked about how revising the standards or revising the usage of a term can be done, and that there's two kind of levels of consideration. There's the conceptual consideration, and there's the fact that because there's a division of labor philosophically, there's mutual consistency standards. But of course, the primary standard is clarity, right? And in fact, Ayn Rand, right, as Zulu points out, uses the term objective in an idiosyncratic way, but it's philosophically proper, and it's necessary given that it doesn't overturn the philosophical commitments. It's the very same thing with the term objectivism. And it's exactly the same way I gave the examples. You destroy the integrity of the thing you're trying to study and you're trying to abstract a tradition from when you take the term, which has, forever been meant this thing. The scholarship about the issue designates this as the term. And then you represent yourself as an advocate of the thing, which the scholarship, which is then emanated to the public, is different. You create confusion by using the term that way. Not only is it confusing, right? So that's already a level not to do it, but it's dishonest because as the creator of a thing, you create something, you are entitled to label what you are. It's like if somebody didn't call you your name. It's like if somebody didn't call the book you wrote by the title you gave it. And in fact, they then took your name and attributed it to something that was like you, that had your likeness in some essential way that you've categorized. It drops the context and it's unjust. If you create a system and you enable it, there's a level of this is your thing. Now, there is a point that Zulu makes. It's like, well, what if Ayn Rand, in doing this, poisoned the well? Because Ayn Rand named her philosophy what she did for a couple reasons. She couldn't name it existentialism, even though she, existence exists, right? That you would assume that her philosophy would be called existentialism, but it's not, right? And Ayn Rand, she deliberated this very issue when she named her philosophy. Like, why can't call it existentialism? There are people who use that term, right? And of course, she thinks that they're philosophically incorrect, but in terms of the issue of scholarship and presentations, it would not be able to do that. She couldn't call herself a logical positivist Ayn Rand loved logic. Okay, she's not a logical positivist. And it's because that she's a contributor to philosophy within the context of philosophical society. And so she settled on objectivism for the reasons of she understands the essence of her philosophy, right? She has philosophy, she conceptualizes it, she understands its distinctness is its, epistemology. That's why it has the name it has. And so it's both unclarifying and it's unjust to refer to you that way. If your goal, if you're thinking morally now, like the issue of advocacy, if you're creating a movement and you are an advocate of a body of ideas that originate from a woman, and then, the way it's, emanated is there's scholarship and there's people who study it and philosophers and there's content creators, you are in fact undercutting the meaning of the primary issue of subject from the thing you're trying to advocate for, right? And this is exactly the point of why calling yourself an objectivist is problematic when you're not. It's because you don't have the philosophy of Ayn Rand, and the term objectivist movement loses its meaning. This is precisely the problem with libertarianism. Okay, libertarians are advocates of liberty. Well, what exactly is the standard of liberty, right? If you just want to purely define a movement in terms of its tradition, it begs the question, well, how do you get the tradition? Like, what is the understanding of the tradition? And of course, if you don't have very rigidly defined the understanding of the term and the context of the term and the philosophy from which the method is abstracted, then of course you degrade the intellectual integrity of the movement, which leads to disagreements and infighting and ultimately is unsuccessful. Look at libertarianism in America. Look at libertarian thought. It's not uniform. There's such a variety of conflicting, contradictory views. That's precisely because libertarians don't have intellectual integrity within their movement. They have this floating abstraction of liberty, and they don't have grounds to identify what exactly the context is to weigh people to it. Well, then if you say, well, the grounds is the primacy of existence, right? You have philosophical grounds to do that. The question is then the conception of objectivism. What's the grounds to do that? And in fact, in practice, whether you mean to or not, you're undercutting the efficacy of the movement you're advocating for, and you're undermining both intellectual clarity to yourself, people that adopt the same semantics you do, and potential people that will encounter your ideas in the future. Because now there are people that will not understand objectivism because there's 14-year-olds on Twitter who say, I'm an objectivist. And by objectivist, I mean, I believe in anarchy and I believe in the primacy of, that's destructive for the movement. It's clear to see that. I think on the actual philosophical issues, it's clear objectivism is not an arbitrary collection of beliefs, because again, the genus of objectivism is philosophy. Objectivism is the philosophy of Ayn Rand. It's not any belief she had. I think that's an incorrect characterization. And when I asked you the question, I think it becomes obvious, right? If you want to identify your philosophy, well, I don't think it's the case that every person needs a name for their philosophy. I don't think so. I don't think they need a single word to designate that. I think the obsession with concretization can sometimes be oversimplifying. David Kelley explains that, you can in fact correctly refer to something with a proposition. It's like if I tried to create a concept to refer to like a particular judgment I saw, like I see a tree in front of me, or I'm dating my girlfriend and I like Barcelona, the soccer team. Do I need a concept for that? No, I don't need a concept for that. I don't need to conceptualize and integrate to that higher level. Propositions in this case are adequate. In fact, describing your philosophy, I think a lot of times are adequate. If you want to describe your philosophy with the approach of I'm an objective thinker, okay, well, that's your epistemology. Your epistemology is, oh yeah, I like the objectivist epistemology. I agree with Ayn Rand's epistemology. It's not, this fetishization with, simplicity is in fact detrimental because it's not the case you need to integrate into a single particular unit. Wrapping up with what I've said, objectivism is the philosophy of Ayn Rand.
Liam,
am I done? Am I done? Okay.
Yeah,
okay. That's all. Thanks. Yeah, that's fine.
I wanted to let you keep going, but it wouldn't be fair.
That's fine.
Okay, guys, thank you for a great debate. You're both very, very bright young men. I think you'll be debating more in the future. And if you do, please come to me. I'd be more than happy to moderate. For people that aren't watching Zulu on his stream, Zulu, do you want to tell people where they can find you? And then Liam, you can do the same thing.
Sure, yeah. People can find me at youtube.com/Liquid Zulu. Just search up Liquid Zulu on the YouTube search bar. It'll come up. I also have a website, liquidzulu.github.io, where you can find, I've only got one course at the moment, but I will be making more. Don't you worry about that. And I'll be making one on objectivism. Don't you worry. Further tweak those Google search results, because my site does appear in Google search results sometimes. Yeah, you can find me there. Yeah, I make YouTube videos to do streams like this. I suppose Michael Leibowitz, if you're watching on my end, you can find him on Rational Egoist. I believe you have Capitalist Corner. Do you have any other shows?
Well, so the thanks, Zulu. Appreciate that. We've changed the channel now to the Rational Alternative because we have multiple shows on the channel. We have Capitalist Corner every day from noon to 1 Eastern time. Then from 2:30, sometimes we go a half hour, sometimes longer. We do Everyday Ethics 3 times a week. We do Crime, Corrections, and Culture on Monday, Wednesday, and Thursday at 3:15 p.m. And on the weekends, we do a special philosophical edition of the Capitalist Corner. But thanks, Zulu. I appreciate that.
Yeah, if people are interested in where you can find me.
That's where I'm coming next, Liam.
Okay.
What'd you think? I wasn't going to ask you?
No, you got it.
Screw you. We're done here, right? Liam, go ahead. Tell people where they can
Quick,
find
cut the
you.
stream, quick.
Yeah. So my name's Liam. You guys can find me. My internet personality, my name is Divinity. Sometimes I go by Prophet Divinity. Prophet Divinity on TikTok.com. Prophet Divinity on YouTube. My primary production of content is on Substack, so you can find my Substack, just Liam Stayton. If you type in Liam Stayton on the search bar, you'll find my link done, and you can just contact me from there. I also have a Twitter, and I think my Twitter is like X Divinity or something along those lines. But yeah, that's where you can find me.
Awesome, guys. Thank you. Thank you to the audience. For now, this is the Rational Egoist signing out. I'm Michael Liebowitz. Take care.